You know, few records capture an era quite as effectively as Stiff Little Fingers' debut album, Inflammable Material. Angry, politically charged and packed with short, sharp shocks of punk rock perfection, it sounds as vibrant and downright explosive today as it did when it first appeared in 1979. The story of the album is one that sees the band pen some of the most potent and controversial singles in Irish rock history.
I don't think we were aware that we were going to upset anybody. We were hoping that it would ring a bell with people at home, and if nothing else, make them sort of stop and say, aye, actually that is actually what living here is like, you know.
It's a tale that sees the band fall under the wing of chart-surfing stars of the time like Tom Robinson.
We did a whole tour around big kind of Odeon type venues, and Stiff Little Fingers opened for us every night. Went down really well. The audience can always relate to the truth and the passion and the integrity of what they're singing, and I think that was what appealed about Stiff Little Fingers.
In the early days, their aggressive stance kick-started a war of words with punk contemporaries, the Undertones.
With ourselves and Stiff Little Fingers being the two token bands from Northern Ireland, and especially the way Stiff Little Fingers made a big deal about coming from Northern Ireland, because a lot of their songs were obviously directly touching on that fact. We were kind of always very sort of sensitive to that, because we wanted to be taken seriously as a good band, not just because we came from Northern Ireland, but because we were a good band.
Well, despite the squabbles, it's an album that's way into the rock history books.
It was definitely the first completely independent album to ever break the official UK top 20. Yeah, I mean, it actually did go into the charts on my 21st birthday, so that was like kind of the best present you could have ever hoped for.
It won the all-important seal of approval from the legendary DJ, John Peel.
It's one of those records that kind of worked immediately, and quite clearly, if you lived in Northern Ireland at the time, it did seem that you'd actually got some legitimate things to sing about, really.
And it went on to influence all kinds of musicians.
I could be a soldier, go out there and fight to save this land.
It does sort of run through the likes of sort of, you know, U2, Sinead O'Connor, all these people. I think the bizarrest one is a French guy called Manu Choi, who apparently is a huge fan. I'll probably call it a day the day that I hear Kylie Minogue's got a copy of Inflammable Material or something, you know.
Inflammable Material was also the album that set main man Jake Burns off on a musical adventure that continues to this day, with the current incarnation of Stiff Little Fingers still recording and touring for a rabidly loyal audience, many of whom first came to the band at the time of that incendiary first release, Suspect Device. To get to the heart of the SLF story, though, we need to go back to Belfast in the mid-1970s. An austere and unrelentingly bleak cultural landscape, where, as Jake Burns remembers, there wasn't exactly much to do.
My overriding memory of Belfast around 74-75 was one of pretty much complete boredom. I know that might sound a bit crazy considering what was actually happening on the streets, but as a direct consequence of what was happening on the streets, bands wouldn't come and play over there. I mean, the city centre was pretty much a ghost town from about 6 o'clock onwards. They had this large security barrier that ringed off. In fact, they actually referred to it as the Ring of Steel. It actually ringed off the entire city centre. So there wasn't really anywhere to go in town to see bands. There were like sort of 3 gigs, I think. 2 of them were up at Queen's University, and they were either mainly for supposedly for visiting bands, but like I said, they were few and far between. And they had a smaller venue within the Students' Union that did put on the odd local band, but generally you couldn't get in there unless you were signed in. So for the general public, it wasn't really a goer. And the other gig was a place called the Pound Club, which was down near Oxford Street bus station. So I mean, it was pretty dead, really. I mean, there were a couple of other pub gigs, but they tended to be like show band gigs and that sort of thing, you know. And you know, certainly nobody was playing what we wanted to hear.
As was the case for many young musicians across the UK and Ireland, that vacuum was initially filled by the sounds of pub rather than punk rock from bands like Dr. Feelgood.
Stand and watch the towers burning at the break of day. Still ain't slowing down, been on my feet since yesterday. Gotta get a move on, trying to find a man I know. Money in my pocket, looking for a place to go. Here's what I've been doing. I've been searching all through the city, see you in the morning down by the jetty.
Basically, you know, I'd played in school bands and youth club bands and stuff with various friends, but nothing particularly serious up until Stiff Little Fingers actually started, and that wasn't until 77. But I mean, up to then, you know, we'd been playing in a band called Highway Star, which was pretty much just a cover version band. By that stage, I was listening to the likes of the Feelgoods and Eddie and the Hot Rods and people like that. So I was really fed up with the big guitar solo, Guitar Hero thing, and I was looking for something that was a bit more exciting.
I've been searching all through the city, see you in the morning down by the jetty.
So how does a young Dr. Feelgood fan make his way into the fledgling punk rock scene?
I think the first people I heard were the Damned, and I thought they were really funny. I mean, my take on it at the time was that it wasn't desperately important. I thought it was exciting, and I thought it was fun, and I thought there was definitely something there that I was interested in. Henry, our original guitar player, was much more convinced by the validity of the whole thing straight away. He sort of went straight out, cut his hair, tore holes in his t-shirt, and bought every available record that he could, you know. I took a bit longer to be convinced. In fact, it was actually the first Clash album that finally was the Road to Damascus experience, if you like, that convinced me that there was worth in this beyond just a sort of a glorious 3-minute racket.
If The Clash's self-titled debut album was a pivotal moment for local kids seeking musical direction, then the arrival of the band in Belfast in October 1977 for a gig at the Ulster Hall was a real turning point, as Jake remembers.
I wasn't aware that there were many other people who were listening to this stuff outside of the guys that I was playing with until The Clash were booked to play at the Ulster Hall, and we bought tickets and we went down. And for some reason the show had been cancelled. I think it was a lack of insurance was the reason it was given. But either way, there were a lot of people milling around and causing a disturbance outside the Ulster Hall. What amazed me was not the fact that they were causing a disturbance, because after all it was Belfast. What amazed me was the number of people that were there. You know, you suddenly then realised that, you know, there were about 200 or 300 folk there, and if they were the ones that bothered to hang about, then, you know, in your mind's eye you envisaged a lot more people who would have been there. So, you know, I suddenly realised that it wasn't just the four of us, that there were a lot of people out there who actually were listening to this sort of stuff.
So, with a sense of purpose in place and a lineup made up of Henry Clooney on guitar, Brian Falloon on drums, Ali McMurdy on bass and Jake Burns on guitar, the band was ready for action. The name, Stiff Little Fingers, taken from a B-side of a single by fellow punk practitioners The Vibrators, was already chosen, and only the issue of who would be the lead singer remained a problem. Jake Burns again.
I became the singer by default. During rehearsal, nobody wants to sing. Nobody wants to go up the front because, I mean, your voice sounds horrible through a microphone the first time you hear it. And it takes almost as much learning as it does to play an instrument, to learn how to actually sing into a mic. Basically, it was probably trying to emulate a cross between Lee Brillo and Joe Strummer, and it ended up just getting the gargling with broken glass aspect that people always refer to.
So with glass duly gargled and band duties decided upon, Stiff Little Fingers sought out some professional help before they took the next step. That came when Jake Burns approached a local journalist, Gordon Ogilvie, for some advice. Having caught their live show, he suggested they go away and write songs about what they knew best, growing up in troubles-blighted Belfast. Taking the advice to heart, Jake swiftly picked up his pen and quickly knocked out Suspect Device and this track, Wasted Life, which would later turn up on Inflammable Material.
I could be a soldier, go out there and fight to save this land. Be a people soldier, paramilitary, gun in hand.
Up until I heard the first Clash record, been playing in cover version bands and stuff, and been singing songs about bowling down Californian highways and what have you, when I'd never been further west than Galway in my life. So when Gordon suggested writing songs about where we grew up, I jumped on it because I thought, yes, this is exactly what we should be doing. When it came to make the first record, obviously we were convinced that unless you were signed to a major record label, you didn't get to make records. You weren't going to get people across from London to come to Belfast to see a band. So we had to create some kind of reason for them to want to come and see us, and the easiest way of doing that was to make a record. And it was actually Gordon Ogilvy's idea to do it. Well, basically he had the money to do it as well, which we obviously didn't have. He actually said to me, look, let's make our own record. And I remember staring at him saying, can you do that? He said, yeah, of course you can. And he hired a local jingle studio, and we went in there one Saturday afternoon and recorded the two sides, minus the vocal. Bizarrely, my voice was feeling a bit rough that day. Probably would have sounded more like me if I'd actually just gone ahead and done it. So I think I went back on the Tuesday night and did the voice on it.
I'm Ralph McLean, and this is the story behind Inflammable Material, the debut album from Stiff Little Fingers. With Suspect Device, the first single, recorded, it was then a question of what next.
When we got them, it was like, so we sat and stared at box upon box upon box of these damn things, and just no conception. I mean, 500 records doesn't sound like a huge amount, but you try sitting in a room with them, it's like, how the hell are we going to get rid of all of these? Obviously the idea was to sell them, but we weren't businessmen, we had no idea at all how you went about this. So we fired off copies to the likes of John Peel, who, God bless him, I think played the record something like 10 nights in a row.
As John Peel remembers in this archive Radio Ulster clip, it was a song that made a real impression on him.
Well, it was one of those records that kind of worked immediately, and of course at the end of it, I'm going to blow up in your face, stop, dead, it's just a great conclusion to a record. I mean, a lot of the punk stuff, looking back on it now, is essentially people were tilting at windmills, they're complaining about issues which they'd never really had to confront, and I thought it was sort of posturing slightly, but quite clearly, if you lived in Northern Ireland at the time, it did seem that you'd actually got some legitimate things to sing about, really.
Being on constant rotation on the John Peel show wasn't without its downside, however. Jake Burns again.
I remember the demand for the thing, initially having thought we were never going to sell these 500, the demand really went through the roof after John started playing the record. In fact, the little cottage industry of making the sleeves and rebagging the record and stuff had reached fever pitch to try and keep up with this demand. And obviously why we were doing this, because we all had day jobs and stuff, so we were doing this in the evening, and we were listening to Peel's programme. And it did actually get to the stage that when we were sat sort of, up to your eyes in Pritt stick and bits of torn record sleeve and stuff, he would play the record and we would literally all be screaming at the radio, stop playing the record, will you, because I can't keep up with this,
So, with the DIY ethos in full flow, that debut single was packaged up in a fetching, if somewhat alarming, sleeve. As a promotional wheeze, it was decided to mock up the front cover sleeve to look like a bomb. But when at least one record company received the package in England, the story goes they dunked it immediately into a bucket of cold water. A real suspect device. Such was the band's dedication to the marketing cause, though, they even loaded up a bread van that was on its way to Scotland with copies. Well, everyone has to earn a crust, don't they? When a local fan magazine called Alternative Ulster asked the band to write a song to be given away as a free flexi-disc in the new issue, another Stiff Little Fingers anthem was born. Picked up by Rough Trade, it became the legendary indie label's first single in October 1978. Surely it was just a question of time before the big boys came calling and fame and fortune was knocking at the band's door.
we got approached by Island Records to come across and do some demo recording in London, which we did, and they announced themselves really pleased with what they heard and basically told us to quit our day jobs. They were drawing up a contract. They wanted us in London by, in fact, they even gave us a definite date. I can't remember exactly when it was now. So we did all that, and then they changed their minds and basically left us high and dry. We were cut adrift at that point and did flounder quite a bit.
All, however, was not lost, as an invitation was forthcoming from Tom Robinson, then riding high in the UK singles chart.
It's a 2, 4, 6, 8, and too late. Me and my radio cooking on through the night.
I'd only just recently had my kind of one-hit wonder track with 2468 Motorway and the album Power in the Darkness, and that had taken us to Belfast for the first time for any of us in our lives, and we'd been totally struck by the punk scene over there. The scene was extraordinary. At Queen's, we had an audience that was like completely across the general divide of the population. There were people rubbing shoulders who in the normal run of things wouldn't get to see each other, and punk broke that down completely. There was such a unique spirit happening there that we gave us an awareness of what was happening across the water, and we kept monitoring it and looking at what was coming along. So of course, as soon as a band starts breaking through from there and you hear Stiff Little Fingers on the John Peel show actually singing about that situation, you think, well, you know, we're trying to deal with the situation in Britain at the moment. Let's have these lads who are trying to deal with the situation that they come from. And so got in touch, invited them to take part, and they said, yeah, we'll come over and support you. And we did a whole tour around big kind of Odeon type venues at the time, and Stiff Little Fingers opened for us every night. Went down really well. The songs went down in England because they were heartfelt, and the audience can always relate to the truth and the passion and the integrity of what they're singing, and I think that was what appealed about Stiff Little Fingers.
I met you in no man's land. Across the wire, we were holding hands. Hearts a bubble in the rubble. It was love at bomb sight. Well, all you gave me is barbed wire love. All tied up in barbed wire love. Tangled up in barbed wire love.
Stiff Little Fingers and Barbed Wire Love. So with the Tom Robinson tour under their belts, surely now the band could bask in the warm glow of major label interest, couldn't they?
So as far as we were concerned, it was just going to be a matter of picking and choosing by the time we got to London, and there wasn't a soul that was interested. Nobody. We were looking at the end of the tour and had no real conception of what the heck we were going to do next. And at that point, obviously, Rough Trade had been encouraged enough by the sales of Alternative Ulster, and Jeff Travis came to the Hammersmith show and said to us afterwards, look, we've never made an album before, you've never made an album before, why don't we do one together? It turned out to be probably the best move we made.
So with Rough Trade behind them as distributors, the band unleashed Inflammable material in 1979. The results were uniformly impressive, from the Ogilvy band originals like Alternative Ulster and Suspect Device, and there was even room for an adventurous Bob Marley cover in the shape of Johnny Was. The success was immediate, as Jake recalls.
It was definitely the first completely independent album to ever break the official UT. It actually went in one place higher than Barry Manilow's Greatest Hits, which I was always really proud of. Yeah, I mean, it actually did go into the charts on my 21st birthday, so that was like kind of the best present you could have ever hoped for.
It was certainly impressive. Not only the first wholly independent album to chart in the UK, it also sold over 50,000 copies and reached number 14. Not bad going for a band who'd been cut adrift just a few months previously. Not everyone, though, was impressed with the abrasive and unashamedly political stance of SLF. Their punk rock contemporaries from Derry, the Undertones, were never taken with the lyrical stance of the band, as main songwriter John O'Neill explains.
With ourselves and Stiff Little Fingers being the two token bands from Northern Ireland, and especially the way Stiff Little Fingers made a big deal about coming from Northern Ireland, because a lot of their songs were like Suspect Device, Alternative Ulster, were obviously directly touching on that fact. Like, we were kind of always very sort of sensitive to that, because we wanted to be taken seriously as a good band, not just because we came from Northern Ireland, but because we were a good band. we didn't want people to feel sorry for us. We were always very kind of conscious of that, you know, so we deliberately did play down that whole thing a lot, because we'd read a great review and think, he just probably feels sorry because we come from Derry.
Well, it's certainly not something that Jake Burns was losing any sleep over. Despite the in-your-face nature of the band's sound, they never meant to cause any real offence.
I don't think we were aware that we were going to upset anybody. We were hoping that it would ring a bell with people at home. I think basically I was a bit concerned that it probably wouldn't have an audience outside of Northern Ireland, but at that time I didn't really much care, because I felt that, you know, there was enough going on around in my life, and obviously in the lives of everybody who was, you know, who was living there at the time, that it merited actually singing about, because apart from else, what the hell else did I know about, you know? I don't really know what sort of reaction we were expecting. We were hoping that it would ring a bell with people at home, and if nothing else, make them sort of stop and say, aye, actually that is actually what living here is like, you know?
Break out and leave this life behind. Break out and see what I can find.
Looking back at the album now, there's still much for Jake and the boys to be proud of.
It's difficult for me to look back on it, because I don't think it's a perfect record by any stretch of the imagination. But, I mean, the obvious tracks that people picked up on were the two singles, simply because they'd heard them enough. Probably the Johnny Was cover. Beyond that, then, you know, songs that have endured, like Barbed Wire Love or whatever. We did get quite a bit of flack for this track called White Noise on there, which we did get quite a bit of flack about. But that was kind of trying to tackle the whole subject of racism head on by simply quoting a whole load of racist diatribe on there, and then in the final verse by turning the whole thing round by doing a racist diatribe against the Irish, the point being we were Irish, and therefore we were trying to highlight the futility and pointlessness of this whole sort of thing. Unfortunately, some people, as people often will, took the whole thing at face value, so we got a bit of flack over that. But basically we got flack from people who didn't understand it, so that didn't, you know, that was like water off a duck's back as far as I was concerned.
I'm gonna try on my terms this time. So if I can do it, you can do it too. Why don't you try it? You got nothing to lose. I'm born and top living from day to day. Do something different, try to break away. I gotta break out and leave this life behind.
Post-album release, the band upped sticks and moved to London, a decision which saw the departure of drummer Brian Falloon and the band's co-manager with Gordon Ogilvie, Colin McLeland. The band would enjoy considerable success in the new years, but the shadow of that hugely evocative and emotional first album still casts a shadow. And the list of artists who still quote Inflammable material as an influence grows with every passing year.
Well, I mean, it's always very flattering when somebody says that they've been influenced by you. I mean, not so much the sort of slavish copyist bands, but I'm always more flattered when it's somebody that has, you know, carried on and developed their own style and their own voice from that. I am more flattered when somebody from Bad Religion, for example, says that we were an influence than somebody that basically sounds like Stiff Little Fingers. It does sort of run through the likes of sort of, you know, U2, Sinead O'Connor, all these people have claimed us as an influence in the past. I think the bizarrest one is a French guy called Manu Choi, who apparently is a huge fan. Quite where he quotes Inflammable Material as being the best album ever made. Where the hell that fits in with what he does, I really don't know. But I was very, very flattered by it, you know. I'll probably call it a day the day that I hear Kylie Minogue's got a copy of Inflammable Material or something, you know.
Like Jake says, the list of bands who continue to be influenced by both the album Inflammable Material and the band Stiff Little Fingers is truly remarkable. You can hear that distinctive sound in everything from the growl of Shane MacGowan to the power punk rush of Green Day. Kylie Minogue is possibly pushing it a bit though, but who knows what the future holds, eh? Inflammable Material by SLF, a classic album from a truly classic band.
I got control of you, and that's a lie, you know. They say you'll never be free, free, free.
I'm Ralph McLean. Thanks for listening.